Thank you very much. Well, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our next presenter, someone that I refer to as a master teacher, a very passionate and innovative educator and writer. Lesley Younge currently teaches middle school English at Mah-ray School in Washington, D.C. And in fact, this is her 19th year in the classroom. Lesley debuted as an author in 2023 with 2 books for young people. And the book that she is discussing today is Nearer My Freedom, The Interesting Life of Olaudah Equiano by himself, which she co-authored with Monica Edinger. It is an award-winning young adult verse novel remix of British abolitionist Olaudah Equiano's seminal autobiography. It has been referred to as a for teachers by teachers kind of book, and I could not agree more. It is also accessible as an audiobook. Lesley's first picture book, A Train Allen, was an inaugural Own Voices, Own Stories Grand Prize winner awarded by Sleeping Bear Press. Lesley is also a poet, and her work has appeared in Michigan Quarterly Review, Midnight and Indigo, Full Bleed, and others, including Poetry Magazine's newest issue featuring poems for young people. And also, I know that there are 2 other books that are in the works, so hopefully you'll share with us some of that as well. So Lesley, welcome.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Vanessa. I appreciate it. And it's so wonderful to be here with all of you today. We're going to be talking about using primary sources and found verse in the collegiate classroom, exploring with Olaudah Equiano. And I do not teach college, I teach middle school. But what I hope to do today is just offer some ideas and some strategies. I'll be sharing some things that I share with K through 12 students, K through 12 educators, things that I've shared with adult English language learners, and then also things I've shared in professional development workshops with teachers in my local area. And hopefully you'll hear lots of really practical ways that our book, Near My Freedom, can be used in any classroom. So a little bit about me. You can reach me at teacherlesley.com. That's my website, and find out more about a lot of different things. But I am a teacher and a writer. We just finished school yesterday, so that's very exciting. And yes, 19 years in the classroom. I have 1 son, and I have 2 published books, and then I'm working on 2 more, which will be about nonviolence. I'm originally from California. I lived in New York for a time, and now I've been in the DC area while living here in Maryland. So to this work, I bring a breadth of different experiences, and one of the things I love to do is connect lots of dots. So if you want to share just a little bit about who you are, perhaps a name, maybe your role, your school, whether you're a student or a teacher, anything that brought you here today, anything that you're hoping I'll talk about, especially, or answer, please feel free to put that into the chat. I'd love to know a little bit more about you as well. So your name, your role, your school, what brought you here today, and anything else you'd like to share in the chat. So a little bit about our agenda. We're doing some introductions right now. I'll talk to you a little bit about the story of Nearer My Freedom. I'll talk to you about connecting that book to poetry, connecting it to history, and connecting it to social justice and advocacy. So no matter where you are in the collegiate world, hopefully you will see some connections. We'll do some processing, some share out, and have time for Q&A as well. So a little bit more about our book. As Vanessa said, it is an award-winning book, and that totally shocked us. But we're really proud of what ended up happening with this book since it came out 2 years ago now. Of course, we were incredibly honored to win the Children's Africana Book Award Best Book, which is one of the reasons I'm here with you today, that we were a 2024 award-winning book. We have starred reviews. We were a YALSA Excellence in Nonfiction for Young Adults finalists. We were on a number of notable and top 10 lists that year. We won some state awards. And we were just so encouraged that this book was received so well by the children's literature and the mass literature community. As it was said, we are teachers who wrote this book, imagining it would be used in the classroom, and it seems to be traveling into all throughout classrooms throughout the country and perhaps throughout the world, and then into many other really exciting spaces. So that has been very exciting to see. It is about 216 pages long, and we did rewrite it for ages 10 and up. So we've had students as young as fifth graders reading it in the classroom, and we've had, again, adult learners reading it as well. One of the things we thought about as we were writing the book, first of all, we came to this story with incredible admiration for Olaudah Equiano. We were familiar with his story, and we found him to be a brilliant example of a person in history who overcame extraordinary hardship to do incredible things, and to use that life of incredible experiences to help other people. And we knew that that story would resonate with students. So we thought about lots of different themes. We really wanted to support continued interest in his story, as a first-person account of 18th century Africa, an account of the slave trade and the British abolition effort. Um, in America, we're often in the curriculums at multiple points in a child's life. They are studying the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, and we never want it to just be about that. We want it to be about where people came from, the kinds of communities they had all over Africa in a variety of countries, in a variety of different settings, a variety of different environments, of tribes, of cultures, of ethnicities, all the different places that people were coming from. And we want it to be about the efforts they had to get free, that it was not that anybody, we first freed ourselves, is what we often say. We first freed ourselves. And we wanted that to be at the center of how we were teaching and how people were talking about the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We wanted to make a complex primary source accessible to secondary students. There are a number of people who may remember encountering Olaudah Equiano's story, first perhaps in college, or maybe if later in high school. And it can be a dense text. It's a very rich, incredible text. The language is beautiful. And we thought children should have access to this story too. And then we also wanted to bring attention to his poeticism and his rhetoric. And we'll show you how we tried to do that as I get into the poetry of the book. We also wanted to make sure the conversation did not just stop sort of at his self-purchase and him getting free, but it went on to the adventures and the complex challenges of his liberated life, especially the reclamation of himself as a person of African heritage who was living and working in the world, primarily in the British Empire. He was reclaiming his identity, he was reclaiming his history and his culture. He was telling his story for himself, and so we wanted to make sure that was also being captured. So some texts we were inspired by, of course, the original, Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, the African, which was published by himself. And that's an incredible story. He retained the rights, published 9 editions, became one of the wealthiest Black people in the British Empire, and was, for all intents, the first best-selling Black author in the world, right? That's an incredible story of that book. Another book that we were inspired by is The Kidnapped Prince, and that is a sort of abbreviated adaptation done by an author named Anne Cameron, and that's wonderful for your first, second, third, and fourth graders. But there really wasn't anything in between these 2 books for secondary students who were in middle school, were in high school. There wasn't anything for them, and we wanted to bridge that gap. My co-author is Monica Edinger. She is a mentor of mine. She hired me for my first teaching job 20 years ago, and we've been friends ever since. Monica is a published author. Prior to this book, she published a book called Africa is My Home. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 70s in Sierra Leone, and that experience deeply connected her to West Africa, especially to Sierra Leone. And she is the person who brought Olaudah Equiano to our 4th grade curriculum when we were teaching together at Dalton in New York City. And she also brought the story of the Amistad. And she was sure to make sure that we were weaving the narratives of people, of individuals, and of the cultures they were leaving from, and in the case of the children on the Amistad, going back to, which was just really informed how I thought about teaching enslavement, teaching that experience, and also personally really shaped how I came to think of it. So another beautiful children's book is Africa is My Home, A Child of the Amistad by Monica Edinger, and I recommend that book too. So first teaching idea I want to present to you is poetry because our book is in found verse. What is found verse? You might have heard of it as blackout poetry or erasure poetry, but it's a form of found poetry where we take an existing text and then we erase or we black out or we obscure large portions of it. And the goal is to create a new work from what remains. So the way this can work is it can be a means of collaboration. You can create an entirely different text from the one you're working with. It can have an entirely different meaning. You can have some dialogue between the two. You can create some contradictions, but it's a really rich way of working with text. And we used found poetry to make it accessible. And so we did not want to change his story. We did not want to change his meaning. We wanted to preserve as much of Olaudah Equiano's original story as we could, but we wanted to make it accessible. So what that looks like, and we have in the book, there is a creating a verse version. We explain what we did, but we went through the text, and I like to say we sort of mined it for the gems. We found the gems that we think really captured the essence of that part of the story, the most beautiful parts of his language, and we highlighted rather than blacked out. That's another method you can use. But as you can see, the parts that we picked out then became poems, and became the poems of the book. And again, in order to preserve the story, in order to preserve the language, but to make it more accessible to a secondary audience. And so we definitely had middle school students in mind, but we have found so many adults really appreciate the found verse version. They are finding it easy and accessible for them as readers, right? Because it's written at about a sixth to seventh grade reading level. And so it doesn't take them very long to get through the story. And so many people have said, I didn't know this story. I hadn't heard of Equiano. I would never have heard of Equiano if it wasn't for this book. I might never have made it through the whole story, but now I feel like I know the tale. And so we have found that adults really enjoy the found verse text, and feel like it's giving them the experience of reading his original primary source. I've also heard and seen with through some different workshops that we've done that for English language learners, people for whom English is a second language, this book also feels really accessible. And we'll talk a little bit about how making found poetry is an awesome exercise for all types of learners, including adults and adult English language learners. So in our educator guide, which is free on my website and on the website for learner, we have a lesson for creating historical found verse. And this lesson is for anybody who wants to write found verse from a primary text. And so something people might do in the classroom is use this activity to explore a primary source that is relevant to your curriculum. It could be anything, any primary source. But we have found that making found verse is a really wonderful close reading strategy for budding historians. And those could be at the collegiate level as well. And so using our book as a model of how an entire book could come forth from a primary source, we have found people using it as a model for creating that historical found verse that they would like their students to engage in. It's creative. It is, there's a lot of agency and choice involved in the task. And also there is sort of this conversation that the poet has as they're making the found verse. Do I want my poem to say the exact thing? Well, I really need to understand the meaning then to capture it. Do I want to say something contradictory or to create a juxtaposition of messages? Well, then I really need to understand both the original text and my argument against it, right? And so you can create these really nuanced and advanced critical thinking experiences for students by using this method of creating historical found verse. So that lesson is in the educator guide and would be helpful, I think, at any level. We have had teachers at the secondary level talk about using it. They showed examples from our book, and then in their curriculum was the book Washington Black by Lesley Younge. And that book is magical. It's beautiful. It's being turned into a series with Sterling K. Brown. So exciting. But that teacher had the students make found verse from a novel, Washington Black. I've had a teacher use our book as an example when their students were making found verse from Supreme Court case rulings. So they wanted their students to really dig into the language of the dissent of the case that they were looking at, and so they have their students make found verse from the rulings in the Supreme Court case. And then there are some wonderful poets who are doing found verse. Tracy K. Smith is one of them. And she has a beautiful poem called Declaration. And if you read it over, you might recognize which primary source she used. Do you know? Do you know? If you guessed the Declaration of Independence, you are correct. So she made a poem that she presents, and reading through it, and there's a wonderful interview with her about it as well on the Poetry Foundation website. But she really wanted to talk back to Thomas Jefferson about the Declaration of Independence as it meant to her, a Black American poet. And she created something really beautiful there. So there are a lot of ways to connect this poetry to upper level texts that might be at the collegiate level, that might be in the English classroom, the history classroom. But we find that our book is being used in a lot of really fun and innovative ways when people want to teach poetry. So definitely think that is one angle. Just to know a little bit more about the structure of the book, we have both the poetry and then there are some interspersed contextual essays. So where we wanted to go further into a topic where we thought students might need context or background, we do have some prose uh, that is explaining topics like the abolition movement in England or like the 7 Years' War, things that Olaudah Equiano is referring to, and that we put those references into the poetry, but that might need further explanation. And so teachers of all levels have found that really helpful as well in building students' background knowledge. Okay, new teaching idea, connecting to history. So in this book, a lot of different historical topics come up. And so if these are historical topics that you're already teaching, this could be a quick read text that helps to either hook students, perhaps at the beginning of a study, to provide them with a first-person narrative experience of it. Again, a text that won't take them too long. So we're going to talk about some points in history that might connect to your curriculum already. So I really see Equiano as this intellectual portal, right? In the writing of this book, I learned so much about things I did not know about, or maybe I knew them, maybe I learned them in high school, I don't know, but I had forgotten them. Right. So I definitely was steeped in the transatlantic slave trade, and there's perspective about that. But the 7 Years' War, global mercantilism, British abolition. I'm an American. I didn't know about the British abolition movement. It didn't come up, right? So learning about this whole other abolition movement that happened very differently than the American one, right? Scientific exploration. Olaudah is a scientist at one point, and so he is on these scientific explorations at the forefront of some innovations that were going on in his lifetime. And then also there are some history of Christianity, some experiences of Christianity. A large portion of his original narrative is about his conversion to Christianity. And there's some really interesting stuff in there if you're teaching world religions, Christianity, different types of Christianity, or at a seminary, perhaps, right? There's some really rich connections that can be made there. And then anything that has to do with freedom, identity, self-determination, social justice rhetoric, we're going to find it all in this narrative by Olaudah Equiano. And this feels relevant because there's just this expanding legacy, right? Many people now tell us that when they go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture here in Washington, D.C., their eyes are drawn to a very small book that's sort of in the corner of this display about Olaudah Equiano, and they say, Matt, because I read your book, I noticed this now, right? And so just his legacy is expanding, and I do think our book is helping. There's a really excellent biography, third person version by Vincent Coretta. That's absolutely for the college classroom. There's a wonderful website called Equiano's World, that's well researched. And just recently, the DuSable Museum did something so cool. They had this Instagram film that was sort of a little from the perspective of Equiano as a child in his African village, and he's holding a camera and sort of live streaming his life before he gets captured. So there's all this wonderful, rich material out there, and I think our book can be a way into some of this. Equiano does begin with his home, his childhood, his people in the Kingdom of Benin. And so if that's a topic, chapter one, one of our very first poems is I Was Born in Isaka, right? And he's going into this rich description of his life in Africa. And this is a really important part of his narrative and an important part of his book and of ours, and something we really wanted to spend time on because when he wrote his narrative, there were these perceptions of Africa that Europeans had that in part allowed them to sort of dismiss and ignore maybe things they weren't knowingly a part of, but certainly things that were going on with the slave trade at the time. And they didn't have social media, they didn't have the news and all of that, but people were able to sort of push out of their minds this slave trade that was going on if they were living in England. And he really brought to light, no, this was a home. These are communities. These are families. These are cultures that are involved in this, and you have to know about them. You have to take note. And so that's a really rich section of the book worth exploring. Once he is purchased by a British Navy officer, he becomes a sailor, and he becomes a very skilled sailor, and he travels all over the world. And so there is this global life to explore. I mean, he went all over the Mediterranean, he went to Central America, he was all over the Caribbean. And so, just from a geographical standpoint, the descriptions of these places in his books are a really rich sort of travelogue. So, just this idea of capturing travels, talking about places and what was going on there in the 18th century, in the late 1700s when he is there. Those are really rich descriptions and exciting part of his book as well. We definitely have lots of those descriptions as poetry in our books that could lend itself to some interesting creative work, some interesting research work as well. Again, I mentioned he was an explorer and a scientist, so he was actually on this really important exploration in 1773. They were going to test the theory of an open polar sea. There were some very significant scientific discoveries, and he cataloged that journey in his journal. And this is one of the parts of the book that like our fifth and sixth graders love the most. He was there, he wrote about the experiences. He's talking about seeing animals like walrus and whales, polar bears, things that very few people had seen if they didn't live there, right? And he's writing about those and reporting back to them from an African perspective. And I think that that's really important to note that he was on these journeys, on these voyages, and part of this exploration. He was also an entrepreneur, right? So he purchased himself, but how does he do it, right? And he's got this sort of business acumen that he's presenting throughout his narrative of how he is, while enslaved, using his intelligence, using his savvy to create situations for himself where he can make the money that he knows will allow him to purchase himself. And so we absolutely included that in the book, right? So he's got this, he's sailing around the Caribbean and he's buying tumblers and then he's selling them at this port and then he's buying two more and selling them for more. And so just this really great experience and example of being an entrepreneur who's using what they have to achieve goals. British abolition. I think that this is such a fascinating contrast to American abolition, presents some opportunities for comparing. Adam Hochschild has a great book called Bury the Chains that could be paired with our text. And it talks about sort of the story of British abolition, that there was a grassroots campaign, that Black Britons were involved. There was a key role for women. They used lots of nonviolent strategies like a sugar boycott. Religion was a huge motivator. So much print material was produced, literature, there's rhetoric, there's debates, there's protest pamphlets. And while there was a low number of enslaved people actually living in England, because most are traveling back and forth from the colonies in the Americas or sailors, sort of engaging the local population of England and pressing on the parliament that was located there is a different experience than what was going on in the American colonies. There's just some more information about British abolition here, and then sort of what happens, how many numbers, and that sort of thing. Again, a great contrast. Um, the history of that involving things like Lord Mansfield's declaration and the Somerset case, the Zong massacre, and that court case involves some very prominent British abolitionists. And these things are impacting American abolition as well, and abolition through other empires too. But I don't know that these things are always brought up in the middle school or high school curriculum. And so if they're appearing in the collegiate classroom, again, our book does touch on some of these things and can help make connections. Equiano is contributing to this effort through his writing and through his speaking. And I think that that's a really important point. So I'll just read one of our poems that captures his writing to members of parliament who he was able to access through his connections in Britain. So this is poem 117. The renovation of liberty and justice rests on the British government. May the time come when the sable people shall gratefully commemorate the auspicious era of extensive freedom. I hope the slave trade will be abolished. May heaven make the senators the dispersers of light, liberty, and science to the uttermost parts of the earth. I hope the slave trade will be abolished. Europe contains 120 millions of inhabitants. How many millions doth Africa contain? If the blacks were permitted to remain in their own country, they would double themselves every 15 years. The British manufacturers and merchant adventurer will have a full and constant employ supplying the African markets. I hope the slave trade will be abolished. Industry, enterprise, mining, an endless field of commerce lays open, an inexhaustible source of wealth. Except those persons concerned in the manufacturing of neck yokes, collars, chains, handcuffs, leg bolts, drags, thumb screws, iron muzzles, and coffins, and other instruments of torture used in the slave trade. The abolition of slavery would be a universal good. I hope the slave trade will be abolished. And so therein we hoped to capture Equiano's use of rhetoric, of phrasing, of all the tools that were at his disposal as a very eloquent person to persuade people in his circle to rise up for the cause of abolition. Something that he came to not without a lot of challenge, right? A criticism of Equiano is that there are points in his narrative where he is honest that he was part of the slave trade, that there were points in time where he was helping Dr. Charles Irvin purchase people for enslavement on the projects that they were working on, where ships he was sailing on were carried enslaved people. But over time, as he is having these experiences, as he is almost kidnapped, as his friends are kidnapped, he realizes sort of that really famous quote, none of us are free until we are all free. And he really takes that to heart and does turn towards abolition. And I think that's a powerful thing for young people to understand, that we do not always immediately stand on the right side of justice, but we can evolve as people and get there. And Equiano has a very honest story about that. Another great book, After Abolition, Britain and the Slave Trade Since 1807. So that's after the Slave Trade Act ends the British slave trade. And then the Royal Navy is out. They got their West Africa squadron and they're attacking and seizing 1,600 ships, right? And freeing about 150,000 Africans. So, sort of what happened after Britain abolished slavery, at least the slave trade. What's the role of the Royal Navy in kind of patrolling? How does that enable further colonization? I think a lot of those things could be looked at. Another book, Rights of August First, Emancipation Day in the Black Atlantic World, is after they abolish slavery in 1834. As an American growing up, I don't think I ever thought about there being an Emancipation Day that was different in the Caribbean and in Canada because those were under a different government. I don't think I thought about that as a young person. But they have August 1st. Now America has Juneteenth, but they have long had August 1st as their Emancipation Day. And then the issue of reparations, that the British government did offer millions of dollars to pay for damages suffered by owners of registered slaves as part of that process. And I think there's a lot for collegiate students to unpack there. There's some interesting people that one can talk about. Charles Ignatius Sancho, really interesting figure, compatriot um, of Olaudah Equiano. There's a great novel by Patterson Joseph, and he's located in England, but he's doing some plays as well. He has like a one-man show that's about Charles Ignatius Sancho. Olaudah Equiano, another person whose story is telling his own story at the same time. They likely knew each other. They're part of the Sons of Africa, forming organizations to support themselves. Again, this idea that they were part of the leadership of the British abolition movement. Other allies in the game, Lord Mansfield, William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp. All of these are people who, once we're reading our book, once we're learning about British abolition, we can get into some of these other people who may be coming up in other contexts within your curriculum. There's a great set of books for anybody who is teaching about the Revolutionary War. At one point, Olaudah Equiano is tapped to be a part of the setting up of a colony in Sierra Leone. He almost goes back to West Africa. And both Lawrence Hill and Mary Louise Clifford have some great books on this topic where they are talking about the people who went from America with the British as they're fleeing. They go up into Canada, they stay there for a time, and then they become part of that colonial effort in Sierra Leone. And again, like I said, I love to connect the dots. And so I love thinking about Olaudah Equiano over here in Britain getting the job. We've got the people in America moving to Canada and then becoming part of that effort. And just sort of all the ways that people were connected back then through different politics, through different experiences, and how none of this is separate. And true understanding comes from being able to see the big picture, right? And I think that our book helps to, again, connect some of those dots. If you're teaching about abolition in the Caribbean, you can definitely, in his book, he talks a lot about um, the revolts that were going on, whether it was Tacky's Rebellion or Toussaint Louverture in Saint Domingue and what was going on in Haiti, the rebellion in Barbados, right? So all of those, that timeline of Caribbean slave revolts that are going on, if that's part of your curriculum, he uses that in his rhetoric to say, if we are no longer involved in the slave trade, if we are no longer supporting slavery, then these slave revolts become, there can be peace, there can be less violence, right? And sort of that being part of the reason that the British Empire may want to begin proceeding with abolition quickly. And we know that the slave revolts did have a huge impact on the speed which they moved. And then if you're working with any of the American abolitionists, whether they're working during slavery or during the civil rights movements, there's some incredible connections that can be made between Olaudah Equiano and people like Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, any of the people who were writing and speaking about these topics, his work, his writing, his speaking, perhaps even using our book and our found poems are an awesome connection to make. So I know I'm throwing a ton of information at you. Just a couple more connections to history. If you're doing worker solidarity, right? The abolition movement is also an economic one, right? And he makes an economic argument for abolition. And so if you're teaching about workers' rights, worker solidarity across time, this could fit into that narrative. This could fit into that narrative as well. So before I get into the last section, just want to check in and see if there are any questions that I should answer in the chat at this time. If there's anything kind of percolating for people. Okay, lots of great introductions. I'll be sure to capture all of these. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so hopefully you're still with me. But just to sort of wrap up the history section, there's a lot that can connect to Olaudah Equiano's story. And again, I think about him as this intellectual portal, this way, the way that one person's story can connect us to many other people's stories. And I just think the breadth of stories that Olaudah Equiano connects to is vast, and it spans the globe, and it spans time. And so I don't know what anyone's teaching, but if there's a connection to be made to Olaudah Equiano, I'm very convinced of that. So I'll leave that. I'll leave that there. All right. Um, the last connection I want to make is if you are teaching or working with students in the capacity of social justice and advocacy, something else we have in our educator guide is about rhetoric, the use of pathos, logos, ethos. So this is a worksheet we made for elementary and middle school teachers. If you are teaching the rhetorical triangle, definitely diving into some of the poems where he is trying to make his case, and there are several sections on that, asking students to locate sort of where his different strategies are. He uses all of them, and maybe you're asking students to mimic those strategies on a persuasive piece of their own. Olaudah Equiano's work can absolutely be a model for that. Often when I'm presenting to young people, I talk about how Olaudah Equiano is an example of someone who found his voice. He found his voice and used it to speak out for the rights of other people, just like so many other people that we admire today. And on the screen, you'll see some of the heroes that our young people are really in admiration of, right? Greta and Malala and our water protectors and all of the students who are working against gun violence here in America. Those are all people that our young people are looking at, listening to, and exploring the ideas of. And then they have their own ideas, right? So how can they also use reading, writing, speaking to empower themselves and to empower others? Olaudah Equiano is a great example of that. You might be doing work around abolition today. The anti-slavery society that he was a part of still exists because slavery still exists. There are still hundreds of thousands of people who are involved in trafficking and forced labor and child slavery all around the world, including in the United States. And so it's still an issue that is being worked on today. Huge opportunity for advocacy, for social justice work, for research, for exploration. There are lots of connections to racial justice today. The photo that you see on your screen of the statue being toppled was during the 2020 social justice uprisings around the death of George Floyd. And so this was a statue of a man named Edward Colston. He was an enslaver, and they threw his statue into the river, right? And so thinking about what Olaudah's work was about, thinking about this iconic photo, this iconic moment in global history, and how they connect today is something we can do. And then so where the Colston statue once stood, they put up a statue of Black Lives Matter protester Jen Reed, and a local artist added that to where he once stood. So just some interesting examples to look at that, again, might engage young college students. So I think we are right at the point in time where we can just do a little processing. So, some guiding questions. I know I went fairly quickly, and I'm happy to go back and explain or talk about anything that kind of popped. But I just wanted to sow some seeds today of some ideas, of some thoughts of the way that Olaudah Equiano's story, his efforts, his writing, and then our book Near My Freedom, where it might take or take root in your classroom. So, if there's anything that confirms your thinking, I'd love to hear about that. If there's anything that maybe challenged your thinking today, maybe there are challenges to my thinking. I always love that. I'm happy to learn from anyone in the room. And I know we have some brilliant experts who are part of today. So I welcome anything about that. Are there things that connect to your students or to your curriculum? Are there any questions that were raised for you? Are there any resources that you might want to share? So we'll just take a moment to kind of process, think about any answers to these questions, and then we're going to open it up for discussion and Q&A. So I already see some things being put into the chat, and again, I'm excited to engage with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lesley. And yes, I'd like to remind everyone that you can turn on your camera if you like. You can raise your hand, and we can also call on you. But of course, you can also type your questions and comments into the chat. First, I'd just like to say that, this book is such a great piece of work. I mean, beyond all these content connections that you've made, I'm really inspired by the opportunities that the technique of Blackout poetry offers us. I mean, not only just in the middle and high school classroom, but also in the higher education classroom, because it doesn't only it promotes a deeper reading of a text, which in itself can be a challenge in today's classrooms, and then also it offers a creation of something new. It's a building skill, engaging the past like a primary source from a consciously present reader. So I find it really endless opportunities because the reader really becomes present in the reading. So I think it's a great way to learn and to
Absolutely.
engage history. I see there's already questions. People are posing some questions, but I also wanted to pose this question. What has been the most surprising or interesting experience while you were writing this book? Or is there anything that challenged your belief, a belief that you had? And then we'll jump into.
Mm. Well, as I was saying, I didn't have a deep background in European history and British history. I was absolutely coming at this from the perspective of an American who was interested. And so, one of the first challenges was just that Olaudah Equiano did not spend a lot of time in America. He comes to Virginia for a very short period of time, and then he was whisked away to the rest of the world. And he mentions, maybe trading in Philadelphia or New York and visiting those places, but they are not central. So I think I had to really decenter my American perspective when writing this book because it wasn't very important to him and it wasn't very important to his story. And he doesn't talk about, any of the major American figures that I was familiar with. He has a whole other sort of worldview. And so I think orienting myself towards that worldview, to understand the politics of that time and the structures of the British government and the ways that laws worked and the ways that people were managing colonies thousands of miles away, and the way that people were trying to galvanize, native English people who, maybe were working in the shipyards but had no idea where those ships were going or what was happening. They didn't know. They were local working class people, galvanizing them around the issue of abolition. It was a different worldview that I had to take on. And I found that both challenging and really exciting, and an opportunity all at the same time.
Yes, wow, thank you. Kole Odutola, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I must say this is a very interesting, fast presentation that keeps you at the edge of your chair all through the presentation. And my observation is that you have done a fantastic job of leaving out nearly all the controversies. And I think that will help because you had your eyes on the prize, if you might allow me to use that phrase, which is to introduce the students to an Africa. And it looks like it was that made up Eurocentric Africa. There were once in a while you brought in Sierra Leone and quickly, came back without that idea of a diversity of this place called Africa that Equiano was talking about. And I wonder, will this in any way play into the stereotype of Africa is a country, but good enough that you brought in the Sierra Leoneans? It at least it gives some kind of background that there's a place on that continent called Sierra Leone. And also, you avoided very dexterously. I just borrowed that word this morning, so you have to pardon me. I had to use it on somebody, and you happen to be the person, to navigate the whole question of ethnicities on the continent. There are people who have said Equiano is Igbo, and I also see that question, every time I go to Trinidad and Tobago, they say to me that it is the Africans from the continent that are bothered about where somebody comes from. But for them, they could start a prayer in Yoruba and add some Hausa to it, and at the end of it, it might be Ga or anything like that. It doesn't really matter to them. So I'm commending you that you were able to avoid some of these notable things, controversies, and I don't know whether that was deliberate or, as we say, it was just one of those ways in which you decided to tell the story. And I must say it again, that you told a beautiful story and you presented it in a very systematic way. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute. And I thank you for your presentation. And I thank also the Center for African Studies in Harvard for doing this. And I say that with a lot of things under this. I won't say it. Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for everything that you brought up, because I do think Equiano presents a lot of controversies that we would not get into in the middle school classroom, that we might get into in the college classroom, and that I think are really ripe for exploration in the college classroom, right at that level. So I think that is where diving into some of that information is really possible. I mean, there are people who don't believe he wrote his narrative at all. There are people who don't believe he was actually born in Africa. There are people who think he gathered up different narratives from people that were living in England and combined them into one. And he was just a great speaker and researcher, right? And I think at the college level, students can really handle that level of nuance. And I think bringing that in would be fantastic. In the book, we do specify that he was born in the Kingdom of Benin and that the Kingdom of Benin is in what is now Nigeria. So I do think we've been careful to neither paint him as someone who was from anywhere in Africa, nor was he from a place that was what our map looks like today. That he was from a very specific place, the Kingdom of Benin, that there, and luckily for younger children, our museums tend to have artifacts from Benin, tend to focus on that aspect of African art. And so that's a pretty easy connection to make. in even a really hands-on way. But then that does open up some conversation about where he was not from, right? And that he was not from Ghana, he was not from Sierra Leone, and that there were all these other places where enslavement was happening that he was not from. And so if he's from the Kingdom of Benin, what are the tribal possibilities, right? He does not necessarily, yes, that he was Igbo, I understand. And that may mean something to certain students, depending on the student population, right? If I have a large population of West African students, and that's possible here in my county, in Montgomery County, it's not happening at my school, but if I'm with a population of people who would understand that nuance, then that might be an angle I really want to go into. So I appreciate you bringing up those opportunities as well. And I think it just depends on who's in the room. I do think we left space for that kind of specificity and that kind of nuance. But like you said, didn't want to get too bogged down in it if it was going to go over children's heads. But I think that the college classroom is a perfect place to dive into so much of that information. So thank you for that.
We have a question from Soji Akomolafe. If you can unmute yourself, please.
I'm sorry about that. I do that all the time. I'm sorry.
Oh, me too.
Spoiler alert. This is not a question, but it's rather a comment. It would be a privilege, really a great honor to be a student in your class. I'm not familiar at all with Olaudah Equiano's work, but you caught my attention like every second, and I learned so much about him that I will want to continue to study him. I hope I'm going to have time to do that, but it's such a great presentation, and I want to thank you. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
And Lesley,
our book is
actually
perfect for you. You don't have a lot of time. You're busy. You want to get the full story, but yeah, exactly. So you should read our book. It won't take you much time at all, but you'll learn even more.
I will do that, I promise. At least
Yes.
I can do it, I promise.
Yes. And are you at Norfolk State? My
Yes, ma'am.
husband's from
it's an HBCU for those of you who don't know, by the way.
Oh my gosh. Well, if you send me an email, I'll send you a copy of our book. I would love for it to make
I will right away, I promise. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Well, on that note, Lesley, do you have a bibliography to share? Somebody asked in the comments.
Sorry? A bibliography, yeah. That I don't know if we're going to be sending out any resources, but that is something that I can do. There is recommended reading in the back of the book, which I don't have my book ready here for you. I should, but I don't. We have a bibliography and recommended reading in the back of our book. And that's happy. If you email me, I'm happy to send you some of our research resources as well. Things that we use to back up our information and to deepen it. So I'm happy to send that out to anybody who emails me. At teacherlesley.com, you can just reach me there.
Great. I see Agnes has a hand up. You have to unmute yourself. Yes, there we go. Lesley, Agnes?
Okay, yes. All right. I just wanted to add my thanks to you, Lesley, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation, which really, for college level, raises all these issues that can be discussed, including the last comments from my colleague, Dr. Kola Odutola, who talked about all these issues, where he's from and things like that. So if you are teaching a class related to, African ethnicity and everything, you can actually point this out in terms of what is left out, what you think is, what he may have, where he may have come from, his source and everything. But I really like also what you put out, like, chapters, sections that one could look at, the intellectual life, Equiano is an intellectual portal, for instance. The global life of Olaudah Equiano, civil rights, issues that actually are very current, very topical, and, to put them in that historical context, and then, look at it even comparatively. How did Frederick Douglass deal with that? How did Martin Luther King deal with that? How did Mandela look at those issues, for instance, to make that global connections? And so I find the way that you've presented it really cuts across so beautifully from K through 16. Looking at it, maybe not so at K, but from elementary, middle, and, college, that it actually is a very accessible book. And what you've done with it is really beautiful because you've made it really accessible for people who cannot read the entire thing, but also how they can actually put it together and make the connections. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much for that feedback, Agnes. I appreciate that. Thank
I
you.
couldn't agree more either. The questions you raised at the end of the presentation, particularly the questions that we could ask ourselves as educators before engaging with the text. What confirms our thinking, what challenges our thinking, what was it, what connects to our students, and what kind of resources would help, elevate the understanding. And I think, as a takeaway from this, just asking ourselves these questions before entering the classroom can really help us, prepare us as educators before engaging the classroom experiencing and making the classroom experience more engaging. So I really appreciated those. I will write those on my wall too. Thank you, Lesley. Do we have any time for, I think we're coming towards the end. Do we have any
Thank you
time?
for that feedback. Yes, those are questions I challenge myself to think of all the time.
The only question that I have is, whom do you find uses your book more? Is it used more at elementary, middle, or, college level? Whom do you find to be more of the people who use your book?
So mostly middle school. It's for middle school students. But we have had, if they're using it in high school, it's usually a quick read, sort of like, finish this within the week. We're going to look at some other texts, and it's more of like a hook. And then again, with some of our adult English language learners, it's been a text that they use for reading a primary source, reading about the transatlantic slavery if they've never studied that history before. We have seen it used for that, but mostly middle school.
Well, thank you so much, Lesley. Thank you for a really thorough, very comprehensive presentation. You really offered so many creative tools to bring this kind of educational content alive, and I'm sure we'll take some with us into the classroom. So thank you again, Lesley, and until next time.
It's been such a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much to Vanessa and Agnes and the other organizers for putting this wonderfully intellectual day today. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. And again, I would love to stay in touch. You can reach me at teacherlesley.com. And you can buy the book on any website, your local bookstore. It's not always in store, but it should be online. And then please do stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate you. So we have maybe 2 minutes for you to grab your coffee or just a glass of water before we start our last presentation at 2 p.m. Eastern.